You're listening to ABC Illawarra.
Well, are you starting to feel a little concerned about the economic news that you're hearing each day and how it appears to be worsening? This morning we're hearing the International Monetary Fund saying that the world is likely approaching a deep recession, that the outlook is gloomy and uncertain, that the world could be facing its worst recession for half a century. What does this mean for Australia? What can we expect to see? Why is raising rates this seeming band-aid for higher inflation? And what could we see that might be different to some other dire economic times we've lived through in this country? Martin North is the principal at Digital Finance Analytics and joins me now. Martin, good morning.
Hi there.
Is it as gloomy as all that?
Well, there are some very dark clouds on the horizon. I think actually in Australia we are better positioned than many countries around the world. But nevertheless, the economic views from the IMF pretty much chime with my own analysis and other people's too, that there are significant headwinds and there isn't an easy way out of it, unfortunately, at the moment.
So, I note that our inflation rate isn't quite as high as the UK or the US, for example, but is that a lag effect, or is it because we are a little more insulated from some of those pressures than the US and the UK at the moment?
Well, we only report quarterly. So, the last numbers are very out-of-date numbers. The results will come out today, and I expect them to be higher. I wouldn't be surprised to see the overall inflation number above 6%, maybe 6.2 or 6.3. But the non-discretionary number, which is the one that's really important, as people have to spend money on these things, could well be up in the sevens because it was 6.6% last time. So the second point is we calculate inflation differently, so we don't have so much housing costs in our inflation numbers, and that means that sometimes it's understating the true situation. The third thing is the rentals. They only really look at the change in rentals. Of course, a lot of people know that their rents have gone up, but that hasn't necessarily flowed into the numbers yet. So there is going to be, I think, more bad inflation news ahead. So I'm not sure this is even going to be the peak.
Okay, so clearly the way we calculate inflation isn't really reflecting some of the cost of living pressures necessarily that Australians are facing at the moment. But how susceptible are we to some of these global shocks? In relation to the war in Ukraine, you'd anticipate that would have more of an effect on European economies, for example. But how susceptible are we to those global shocks?
Well, I think we are still somewhat exposed. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The cost of LNG, liquid natural gas, has gone through the roof. Our prices locally here in Australia are driven off the global market. Although we are a massive exporter of LNG, we are paying the same price. In fact, we're paying quite a lot more often than some other people around other parts of the world. So the LNG cost flows then into prices for power and other things here in Australia. That's one of the reasons why our electricity bills are going up so much. So that's an exposure that you can't escape. The second is China. China is slowing dramatically. We are a major trade partner to China, and the question is if they stop buying some of the stuff they've been used to buying from us, that could have a significant economic impact on us. The third is, of course, we import oil, and whilst the headline price of oil has come back a little bit, it's funny how when oil prices go up, the prices at the pump go up really high. But have you noticed how it takes a long, long time for them to drift back lower again?
Oh, yes, I think we've all noticed that, yeah.
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons why, in fact, we can't see ourselves completely disconnected. But we do have a smaller debt pool than many other Western economies, which is good, except, of course, we have massive debts sitting on household balance sheets because of big mortgages. And the cure for inflation, which the central banks are going for, is lifting interest rates. And we are highly exposed to those lifting interest rates because we have so much debt on our, on our normal everyday balance sheets, as it were. So cost of mortgages is probably doubling or more. That's going to be a very significant impact. So we are, I think, somewhat exposed.
Okay, so that's interesting, because I know that one of the only tools that the government and the Reserve Bank have is this lifting of interest rates to combat high inflation. And I noted this morning, I read an article about one country that decided to go against the grain in that regard, and that's Turkey, and decided to leave their interest rates stable, thinking that might have an impact on inflation, but it did not. They're having a terrible time. So it does look like we as a country, as a community, are more exposed than other countries, as you said, because we can't cope with these increases in interest rates because of high debt. I mean, is there anything, high personal debt, household debt, is there anything else that can be done to rein in inflation that won't cause so much pain here in Australia?
Well, one of the very important questions is, will people start asking for high pay rises? And it's interesting how Phil Lowe some time ago said, look, if you start asking for big pay rises, that's going to put upward pressure on inflation. But that's a tricky argument to run, isn't it? And other central bankers have tried it around the world. Okay, inflation is going to be temporary, they say. It's going to come back. So don't try and command significant pay rises, because that will just embed inflation further. But actually, I think that's a bit of a specious argument. The fact is that people have lagged behind for a decade in terms of real income growth, and at the moment, real incomes are going backwards in real terms, absolutely more than the last decade or so. So there's a real issue there as to whether you can really clamp down on wage increases. The other course of issues to think about is we've got very low unemployment at the moment, and one of the arguments is, well, with such low unemployment, maybe it won't be quite as bad because more people will have jobs. The question I've got is, what's going to happen to the jobs market? Are we going to find that firms are going to have to dial back on employment simply because they can't afford to pay people more? So these are really complicated, difficult things. I make the point that lifting interest rates is such a blunt instrument. It hits all parts of the economy. It hits businesses. It hits households. And really the question is it the right toolkit? But as you say, there isn't really other options. And it's interesting, if you look at the IMF report that came out, they show that pretty much all central banks around the world, other than Japan and a couple of others, have started lifting and dramatically lifting. They're all lifting in unison. And that higher interest rate force is really the thing that's going to create the higher inflation for longer.
Okay. I'm speaking with local financial analyst Martin North. In that case, if we just take a look at what the IMF's saying, the world could be facing its worst recession for half a century. For those of you listening who remember the 70s, I'm wondering, Martin, what you think. If you compare it to the 70s, a lot of people constantly make comparisons because a lot of the instability that we're seeing now in oil prices and those sorts of things are very similar to those times. Are you seeing any differences, or are you feeling like this is a replay of the 70s? What's happening?
Well, I was around, and I can remember the 70s, unfortunately or fortunately. And look, it started by saying, central banks said that, well, it's just transitory, right? It's not going to be, pretty bad. And then it was just oil, all right? And then they said, well, we'll start lifting interest rates and it'll be okay. And then wage rises started to take off, and then, it started to really escalate and cascade, and it took a long, long time to get under control. A lot of political instability, a lot of social instability fell off the back of that. Now, this time, the big risk now is we've got so much debt in the system to start with, because back then there was some debt there, but it wasn't dramatic. This time we are much, much more exposed to these higher interest rates because of the much bigger debts that government has and also households have and businesses have. And our international debt situation is also pretty extreme too. So I think we're very sensitive now to what's going to happen. So there are some significant differences to the 70s around debt, but the overall trend and trajectory feels horribly similar to me.
Just finally, I mean, if you were a betting man, most people who work in the markets have a little of this tendency to them anyway. The prospect of people having to, of mortgages defaulting, of foreclosures, of higher unemployment, do you see that on Australia's horizon?
Yeah, so I unfortunately think that unemployment will start to tick up a little bit over the next year or so. And I do think that we know the RBA said that 40% of households will be seeing significant lifts in their mortgage repayments. Some of those will actually have great difficulty in paying. Now, the what will the banks do? In some cases, the banks may be flexible, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that. But I do expect to see higher levels of defaults. Property prices are already falling, of course, and we're going to see more of that too. And I guess the point is that all of these things are coming, like a sort of a big storm ahead. Nobody quite knows how much damage is going to be done, but I think the damage is going to be significant, and it's going to be longer term. It's not going to be all over by next March either.
Martin, thanks again for your insights as always. Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
That's Martin North, Principal at Digital Finance Analytics, a local financial analyst, speaking to us here at ABC Illawarra.